I'm Mark Branson, and this is just a brief video to talk through some of the missional change or neighborhood engagement, joining God types of frameworks, but we want to talk about them in the context of larger churches. Um, Most of the types of things that have been included in the books and parts of the class so far would actually work in any church because all of these things are kind of a human scale. They all have to do with church participants, church members, discerning and exploring relationships with neighbors. That may lead to other things, as you've noticed, whether an immigration resource center or scholarships for neighborhood kids, but those all come out of and remain in the context of these relationships, this network of God's creativity and God's engagement in a place. There's a couple of ways that we've seen large churches become more attentive to what God's doing, less caught inside strategies, the structures that come with modern corporations. And so large churches have been formed largely inside of a 20th century understanding of Western corporate life. But there was a time when there were large organizations that worked very differently. These were the medieval cathedrals, and to an extent, this lasted up into other centuries before the kind of hierarchy and control elements became more obvious, more normal. So, at one time, cathedrals worked with a region of smaller chapels or churches. The cathedrals could do things that the smaller village churches couldn't do. Now, this was before you'd want to commute 30 miles, 20 miles, 15 miles to church, because on the normal week, your town gathered perhaps in some way that let it worship, sometimes, depending on later on liturgies around the table, but even before that, love feasts of different kinds. But the purpose of the cathedral was to serve the strength and faithfulness of all of these smaller gatherings throughout a region. And so a cathedral could do things like have a hospital or train leaders or have some types of schools. But their job wasn't to do a weekly activity for everybody within 20 miles. But instead, they would work at encouraging, training, preparing, and a couple of times a year, just like with the Jewish temple, 3 times a year, there would be a gathering, a major event. It's just that we try to do those in some churches every week. And it just uses the vast majority of the resources and energy and imagination is just to keep these gatherings functioning in a way that keeps drawing people in. And instead, if you just do that a few times a year, it can be rich and wonderful and amazing. But that the normal patterns of life are lived out in smaller churches throughout a region. And the cathedral would resource that in the way of training, like I say, healthcare, education, or other things. So this would be where a large church would intentionally engage the churches, say within 5 miles maybe first, and just say, how can we be of help? What are the ways that we can, in instead of, as we've noticed, we've grown large, we're not sure at all that that's the best thing to do. We'd rather partner with you, learn, listen. You know this neighborhood. You know what's going on here. Are there ways that we can simply engage life together? We may have even some members that would like to join with you in loving your neighbors. So I've seen this happen in churches where the large church simply would give up the priority of its own gathering capacity and instead enter into the life of the other churches throughout an area. But let's talk about the kind of question that Alan Roxburgh and I have received more than once with large churches that are wanting to explore a less corporate, a less goods and services approach to church life. And this is an immense shift because all the DNA of the church is around experts and staff and programs and funding and strategies and official reports and a board that's set up like a corporation and decision making that's set up like corporations. And so if a church like this would ask, then there's a whole different set of practices and activities and experiments that can help a church explore this. We're currently just beginning some work with a large 30,000 member church in Korea. And this is their question. They've watched what's gone on in some smaller churches, 1,000 and down, that we've had a privilege of working with. And they've had some of their pastors, including their senior pastors, sit in on seminars and converse with those pastors and us about what it is that's going on. Why are these churches actually developing relationships that aren't so centered around programmed activities of tracts and evangelism, even social justice, although all those things may have a place at a time. But more it's a matter of how do we develop real human relationships where we tell stories and God's got a chance at engaging us and our neighbors in new ways. And so in a large church, there's a number of different elements that can come in at different timing in different ways. And so there's just no one way to do this. But think about it in several ways. Again, the purpose of the leader, the main job of the leader is to create an environment in which God's people, the everyday people in the church, gain the capacities to discern what God's up to in their own physical reality, in their geography, in their daily rhythms of life. How do we shape an environment where that's more likely? So that's where we're going with this. Now, you have to do that while you don't change anything. It doesn't help to stop the 5 Sunday services. It doesn't help to get rid of half of the 60 pastors. There's a whole lot of things that just need to keep going on their normal rhythms at this point. But in the midst of that, then you can do seed planting. For instance, where are the places that several times of doing Lectio in Luke chapter 10 without any programmed expectations, no new strategies, simply creating larger capacity to see these biblical texts in a way that the Spirit messes with people's lives and expectations. In a church similar to this, Alan and I were asked for a seminar with the young adults, the 2 days with the young adult leaders, actually. These were the leaders of many of the small groups and various activities of the young adults of the church. And there were 120 young adults in the room because the young adult group was around 1,000. And we just knew in these couple of days, we were going to plant seeds. There was not going to be a massive organizational shift. We simply wanted different conversations. And so we would do things like Lectio. But we also created activities. We had them write on newsprint. Where are you week in and week out? What groups of people are you with? Class at school, friends at a pub, Korean church would probably be someplace else, right? Where do you work? What are the different places, geographies, types of groups, their purposes, or what's their nature? And what are your activities inside that group? What are the actual practices? Now, we're doing this to get them to realize they're in different settings and they have activity patterns in those settings because we're going to mess with their practices, right? And so it simply got them understanding they are in places, geography matters, and they are doing practices. They have habits that are built into that particular set of people in that particular geography. And this is going to make a lot of progress, but then the next day as we worked with Luke 10 and Acts 16, maybe Jeremiah 29, I can't remember for sure, but we simply started saying, here's how God shapes people in geographies with particular gatherings or particular relationships so that they pay more attention to what God's doing. And so think about the places where any of these things you could try if the goal is to actually see God, to learn what God's doing way ahead of us and around us, to simply have a deep, deep conviction that God's grace is abundant and active in this place. So again, it's just seed planting, isn't it? It's just simply creating environments where people may start thinking differently. You could do this, obviously, with sermon series. Sermon series very seldom change anything, but they can be a way to plant some seeds and spark imagination. Are there other gatherings for classes or certain groups where doing Lectio more regularly becomes a way of listening to what God does on the ground? Whether in that kind of study or another study, simply go through Acts and ask, where does God surprise us? Where's God connecting in ways we didn't plan on? It's just full of stories. Why in the world would God start with an Ethiopian eunuch? This just breaks too many social norms. Why did Paul need a vision 3 times from God before he'd go see Cornelius? And then Cornelius is the one. Here's a Gentile military man that has testimony stories that Paul needs to pay, or Peter needs to pay attention to. And Peter then gets converted. Look, God's doing something here. We just need to pay attention, says Peter to the Jerusalem Council. Paul, then on the missionary journeys, he'd try things, and sometimes those experiments would work in one place and not another place. The Spirit would stop him in another place. So look for the surprises. It'd be a great way to study Acts. Again, these kind of studies can happen in classes, in small book discussions, in sermons. But at that point, you're simply creating an awareness. Now, you do need to be aware that if all you're doing is changing thinking and stories, and unless it gets into patterns, it can simply be one more phase of something we talked about back in those years. There can be an inoculation resistance. That's not us. That's an interesting story. Let's move on. And so some way in the midst of this seed planting and consciousness raising, there needs to be some people, again, usually around the edges, not programmatic, not down the center, where you're trying some of the neighborhood things that we've talked about in other videos. And so I'd be looking, first of all, to be aware that that pastors can't lead this unless they're doing it. And so a pastor, we often in the D-Min program and some of these other activities where we're invited in, we'll take 3 to 6 months for the pastor to be in their neighborhood 3 to 5 hours a week, asking God, what are you doing? And as they ask God, what are you doing? They're acting like a neighbor. They're in a shop. They're in a coffee shop. They're doing normal things. They can't be there as a professional, as an expert, as God's primary soldier for this place. But as they're out there, consistently, we see God engaging them and teaching them new things in ways that we could have never given them in a lecture or a book. But as the pastor starts having these kind of experiences, and then invite in 4 or 5 people to become a learning community. And this learning community then is going to start doing the same thing. For a number of weeks, you're just doing one thing. You're saying, God, show me where you are in some element of my daily life. Whether that's in my physical neighbor's apartment place, the blocks around my apartment building, wherever it is, that they start learning God really does engage my neighbors and me. And so it's, again, no plan to strategize this. It's simply this experimental way forward. And what happens if you can create 3, 4, 5 learning communities around the edge of the church? And they're trying things, action, reflection. So they're constantly gathering back together, doing more Lectio. And then they're saying, here's what I did, here's what I learned, here's what I'm going to try again. That's that same rhythm. And sometimes there needs to be a coach to simply remind them, that's what we're talking about. We're going to do Lectio, then we're going to do action reflection. Here's what I did, here's what happened, here's what I'm going to try now. And that rhythm inside these groups, and occasionally you might have a larger gathering where all 4, 5, 6 groups that are trying this get together for a meal, do Lectio, and you have what's called diffusion of innovation, building on Everett Rogers stuff, where these stories get more widespread. And there are ways then for these stories to filter into other places. Not in a kind of threatening, we're going to change everything way, because again, that creates resistance. It is not a helpful way. But a story occasionally in a sermon or in a newsletter or on the website. And what's important is that this stay at that level, because it will never help if this simply becomes a new program that people are invited in and out of, and occasionally they choose to do it otherwise. The idea is this DNA shift within the organization, where this becomes normal life, to pay attention to what God is doing, and then to participate and to tell stories and to keep learning out of that. And so it's these coached groups inside a congregation that then gain the capacity to coach another group. Because as the word spreads, more people want to do this. And in the midst of this, you're still doing the seed planting thing, the larger group Lectio, a book group getting together and reading Al Roxworth's book, Joining God. Something like that just lets you continue to put the seeds out, but you're not wanting to raise the temperature too much. You can create reactivity that creates huge resistance if this is done in a way that feels too tactical. But between the seed planting, the on-the-ground activities, the gatherings to share stories that then can permeate to where eventually we've seen where the whole the large center of the church is converted into this different way of understanding church life. So it can't just be a matter of early adopters. Eventually, it has to continue to spread in that way. So that's what we've seen that's relevant to small churches and large churches, and we've seen this in larger churches to where patterns start spreading through all parts of the church.